Hi, gang. Okay, so today we are talking about story and argument. It should be a pretty quick lecture. Not that these aren't important. In fact, they are, in that story and argument are pretty much the ways that you get from the beginning of a piece to the end of it. The first line, the first sentence, to the last line, the last sentence. There's infinite ways of doing it, but when we talk about how, they're lumped together in these terms of story and argument. Story we reserve, or at least in this class, will reserve for pieces of fiction. Even though there's narrative poetry, there's narrative nonfiction that will use elements of story, and then argument is sort of reserved for lyric poetry and many of the essays we'll be reading, whether it's memoir or sort of a more personal essay type thing. So let's get to some terms. Let's do some defining so you can get a sense of what we're talking about here. Story, when I talk about story, what I mean is conflict working toward resolution. Any story you ever tell begins with some kind of conflict, something wrong, some obstacle, and then how that thing gets resolved, or whether it gets resolved. Argument, on the other hand, is supporting a claim through evidence, right? So this is less based on cause and effect, and then therefore the structure of these things are a lot more fluid. Nonfiction and poetic structure, it's really hard to pinpoint, but we'll do our best. Okay, so let's start with story and pieces of fiction, and talk about if it's conflict working toward resolution, what does conflict mean? I like my math equations when it comes to writing. I like it to be a science, even though it's not a science. So I see conflict as desire plus danger, right? So you've got a person who wants something, very basic. Cinderella, it's a nice classic way to begin with narrative. Cinderella wants not to be sort of the slave to her godmother. No, stepmother. The godmother's the fairy, the good one, the evil stepmother. That's right. So that's her desire. The problem is there's nothing that she can do. She's sort of slave to her stepmother. And so this is the conflict, right? She can't be a princess, but she wants to be a princess. It's very basic. So from there, you can see how stories get developed, right? There's sort of a step-by-step process. We'll break this down a lot more when we look at our fiction unit in a few weeks coming up. But step one, you have to introduce a character, and then that character's desire. Who is this person? What do they want, right? Everyone wants something. If you got a character who doesn't want anything, you don't have a story. Or you can have one, but it's a very, very boring story that no one wants to read. Then, as soon as you do that, establish an obstacle to that desire. Some stories do this in the very first sentence. We're going to read A.M. Holmes' story, "Do Not Disturb," in a few weeks, and the opening line is something, I'm forgetting it, but it's something like, "My wife, the doctor, has cancer." Boom, immediate steps 1 and 2, right? We have this woman, she's a doctor. I think she's even like a cancer doctor, like of some kind. I'm not sure. Anyway, and then she has cancer, right? So she's this person who makes people well, and she herself is sick. And you've got a story immediately from that. Once you do that, you have to complicate matters. This is sort of the big middle of the story, and it's always the hardest part. Where do you go from there, right? How do you complicate it? Again, we'll look more in depth at this when we look at our fiction unit, but this is sort of what happens in the middle. Once you set it up, things have to get worse, worse, worse. Remember from the school, how the school complicated matters by escalation and exaggeration. More things kept dying, and the things that were dying were more and more serious and dire. Okay, then finally step 4, resolve conflict, which involves one of two things. One, the main character gets what he or she wants, or the character does not get it, and we understand why, right? So that it's not necessarily a happy ending, that everything has to be resolved and wonderful, but if there's a reason that this character cannot get what he or she wants, we have to understand why that's the case, and then what that means for the story. So this is your basic structure. I know it seems to reduce story, like fiction stories, to just like bare bones, boring stuff, but if you start looking at narrative this way, you'll find that even with just 4 steps, every kind of story that can ever be told, the point here is, think of it not as a limiting thing for what you can do, but rather a guidelines. It's almost like the blank staves on which you can write your music, right? You got to fit them in those 5 lines, but you can do whatever you want. Okay, so we'll look at this more. Okay, so key thing before we move on to argument, you must avoid the Deus Ex Machina, which is this Latin term, which translates to God from the machinery. The idea being, way back in classical drama, they would literally have men suspended above the stage, and then they would drop down on ropes via machinery and then say, okay, you have gotten everything in a big mess. I, God of whatever, will come and fix it. And then they would just sort of magically fix it, then leave, and then the play was over, right? It's a total cheat. No one wants to see that happen. So you're doing it when you have no. Well, it's basically here's some rules. Yeah, we'll start with this. Nothing new can arrive at the end to resolve your conflict. That's what a Deus Ex Machina is, right? Some new person, a new object, a new idea that is nowhere else in the story that just announces itself and then solves everything. Don't do it. The classic way this happens in beginning stories is that somebody pulls out a gun and shoots a person or shoots themselves. Unless that person has been set up as a killer or that gun has been planted. Remember that Chekhov thing about no gun. If a gun is on the wall in the first act, it must go off in the third, and how that means that everything needs to be set up in advance. And then rule 2 is if you want to resolve your story, look to your story and what's going on in it, what you've done already. Don't look outside to bring something in and be like, here, fixer, come fix my story and end it. So some examples of Deus Ex Machinas are like in Snow White, if let's say Prince Charming comes, it's a bit of a Deus Ex Machina, right? He comes in out of the blue and just finds her and kisses her, and she wakes up. It's wonderful. He's like a god that way. But at least in the Disney version, remember that she has that whole song, "Someday My Prince Will Come," which is just a way for us to be okay about this. Right? This is something that she's been expecting, and it's sort of cosmically so. Or imagine the Three Little Pigs, if the third pig got a gun, say, and just killed the wolf when he came to the house, rather than having the know-how to build a sturdy house. He just takes care of it with a sudden gun. Or anyone with like a very sunny disposition, people that are happy, have really good lives, just suddenly commit suicide without people having without the character having discussed it or thought about it or whatever. Okay, so whatever you want to do at the end, make sure it's established throughout the story. Okay, like I said, look to your story and what's in it, not outside of it. So is that the end of, yeah. So for instance, Sea Oak, the story reading for Tuesday, look and see how George Saunders does this, right? When and how does he establish the conflict, and when and how does he resolve that conflict? And seeing as how there's sort of a powerful zombie in the story who can do whatever she wants, how does he include a powerful zombie without making it a Deus Ex Machina? Try to figure that out, because I think it's really clever how he does it in the story.